Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. I know it's been a while, and I apologize for my abrupt absence, but I had to take some time away from the channel for personal reasons, and I also wanted to stockpile some content for the next few weeks, so please stay tuned for that. I wanted to share with you all today one of the games that I recently concluded with a very good friend of mine. We like to play these 7-day games online. I like this format a lot. It allows me to calculate various lines, double check my calculations, and improve my calculation skill in general. And I think in this game, I did so very well. I actually had 2 brilliant moves, as noted by the engine, which makes me feel very good. As I mentioned in the title of this video, I think it is the best game I have played this year. So without any further ado, let's jump into the game here. My opponent with the white pieces opened up with e5. E4. I played e5. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. We have the Ruy Lopez on board. a6, I think, is the most popular way to play in the modern setting. I like to play this idea just to see where the bishop wants to go. He goes for the more popular bishop a4. I get my bishop to c5. He castles knight to f6. He plays d3, d6, knight c3. So nothing too extravagant right now. I'll go ahead and put one more move on board. I castle, and after bishop g5, I'll go one more, excuse me. We're both fully developed at this point, minus the queen. Bishop e6, just to help defend that weakened d5 square. And of course the bishop on g5, excuse me, is pinning the knight. So very common things to see here. None of us have really made any mistakes up to this point. Bear in mind, we are lower rated players. We're not anywhere close to titled players. So I think we both got what we wanted in the opening here. I got most of my pieces out to pretty active squares. Pawn structures, very similar. In fact, it's symmetric in this position, minus the a-pawn. So I think both of us are doing well in this position here. He goes for bishop b3 here, just to kind of offset the bishop on e6. The d5 square is a weak point in my position, so I'm definitely trying to make the necessary preparations to defend the square. I don't want to see a knight jumping there uncontested, for example. After I play the move h6, just to kind of see where his bishop wants to go, he captures my bishop on e6. I recapture with the pawn. Again, the idea is simply just to watch over the d5 square. He captures my knight, which I don't necessarily think is the best continuation for for white in this position. I think more common is for the bishop to retreat to the h4 square and maintain the pin. But I capture with the rook, although the engine would like to have seen me capture with the queen. It's not that big of a difference in terms of the evaluation, but I go ahead and capture with the rook. And in this position, my opponent plays queen to d2, which doesn't necessarily seem like a bad move, especially to the untrained eye. It just seems like you're fully developed now. You're trying to look over some of the dark squares, and you just gave up your dark square to bishop. Seems pretty logical on the surface. However, I spent some time looking at this position, and I decided to play a move that seemingly looks a bit crazy, but the computer has validated the move. I struck some inspiration from, if you are familiar, anyone watching, with the Sicilian Dragon, where it's typically the c-file that is completely opened. The knight is placed as such on c3. After queenside castles in some lines, you have to be very aware of the rook sacrificing itself for the knight. And for some reason, I just thought this idea might work. And according to the engine, it does. So as you may have noticed by the thumbnail, rook takes f3 is the move that I decided to play. And it works primarily because after the rook is captured, this knight to d4 idea is so strong. What's exactly happening here, you may be wondering? Well, the first thing is you'll note that the queen can't make use of the e2 square to defend the pawn. Similarly, if she goes home, let's just put this on board, I thought, all right, well, now I can play queen f6, putting more pressure on the pawn. And after the king steps up, that's the only other way to defend the pawn. My rook can get into the game and attack the pawn for a third time, and there's not a successful way to defend the pawn. I can also potentially, let's just say he makes a passing move. I'm not really sure what. Let's say he goes after the bishop or something. Well, now I can capture the pawn. Let's say captures my bishop. I don't know. It's a mate and 7 from this position, starting with starting with queen to g6, or queen g5. So it's already losing for black if this line was played. So basically, losing the pawn leads to much more significant problems for white. So after this knight to d4 idea, he played the most accurate move in the position, which was to step up with the king g2. I go for queen f6 now anyway, just because I know that the pawn is very weak, and I know I can get my rook in play, or if I can get my rook in play, I'm going to have some very good chances to win. He goes for f4, and at the time he played this move, I thought that this was the best way to deal with the pressure of the pawn. I couldn't see a successful way for him to defend it otherwise. And my move in response is actually throwing away all of my advantage. The computer says I'm winning by -11 right now if I find this very easy to see. And I'm a little disappointed I didn't even consider it. I played the computer suggests queen to g6 is just winning. The king has to retreat to h1. My knight can make use of this square with tempo, and it doesn't matter where the queen goes. I play queen h5, and there's no way to stop mate on h2. So that was the line that I just didn't see. I wish I had, because it would have ended the game much more decisively and sooner, but I did play this, or rather I captured the pawn, and after he plays f3, white has done a fabulous job of equalizing this position. I'm slightly winning, but not even by -1. I think the computer at the moment is reading -6. So advantage is gone. I play queen h4, just hoping to frighten my opponent, because at the lower levels of play, you play moves that you think are good, and at the time I really did think this was a winning idea, or at least my attack was still sufficient enough for a win. According to the engine, it is not. The best move for white in this position is to move the knight back to e2 and try to trade off the knight on d4. The knight on d4 is probably my best piece. So, unfortunately for my opponent, though, he did not take advantage of his brilliant play up to this point. He had defended exceptionally well, it must be said. But instead of moving the knight to e2, he moves the knight forward to a4, going after my bishop. And according to the engine, I can ignore this threat and play the move that I eventually find a couple moves later. But I decide to react to the threat. I go bishop a7. And again, the position has swung back to a neutral position. But after my opponent's next move, which was to try to kick my knight out of the d4 square, again, this seems perfectly logical. And at the time, I sat with this position for quite some time, I think over a day, just checking in and calculating different lines. Because what I wanted to do more than anything was keep my attack going. I didn't want to come back to the c6 square. I felt like if I did so, he could play d4, and all of my advantage is just completely gone. I didn't have anything if, for example, I'll just put it on board, I go back, then d4. I felt like in this position I was just dead lost. According to the engine, though, I'm actually doing perfectly fine because the knight is trapped. So if I play this b5 idea, I'm still winning. But in my mind, I thought, that knight's not really contributing to the position anyway, so who cares if I end up winning the knight. However, this position I found a very, very cool idea, and I will let you take a brief moment to try to find the best move in this position for black. Okay, so the winning idea is actually knight takes f3, another sacrifice of a piece, this time a minor piece, because there's really no good way for my opponent to deal with this threat. This is actually a decisive sacrifice. For example, I thought if the rook captures, I have this really clever queen g4. And this bishop, as you can see, is an absolute dominant piece, taking away several key squares, not only from the enemy king, but also all of the white pieces. So the king can't make use of f2, for example, to defend the rook. It has to retreat to either e1 or h1, f1 or h1, in which case I follow that up with taking the rook with check. So I knew he couldn't capture with the rook. And similarly, if he blocks, I just take him with the pawn. So I knew that was no good. So then I thought, well, what if the knight is captured by the king? Well, in this position, I can play queen to h3, and this is something that I had already calculated through. If he takes the pawn, it's just mate on the spot. Rook f8 is mate, so he can't take the pawn. So he has to retreat. If he goes to e2, I give a check. If he goes here, you might think I'm in trouble, but I thought I would just capture, get my bishop on a very good square, defending my passed pawn. He can go wherever, it doesn't matter. b5 was the line that I saw. And I'm not winning by a lot. According to the engine, there is still some play for in the position for white, but it's still very difficult, I think, for black to play. Similarly, let's go back to this line here where the king retreats. I go queen check. If he goes here, I obviously take the rook with check, and I'm simply winning in this position as well. So I just didn't really see a great way for him to deal with this knight to f3. So I played it in the hopes that it would lead to winning chances. He captures with the rook, and we already saw what happens in this position. I give a check. My opponent blocks with the rook. I end up capturing, and my opponent resigns the game in this position. So I want to give a special shout out to my friend for playing this game with me. This was one of the most fun games I have had all year, and I am so proud of my play. I didn't make any egregious mistakes. I had no blunders. In fact, I will show you the review very quickly here. I played with 80% accuracy, 81% if you round up. I had no blunders. I had 2 missed wins, as we saw throughout the analysis. No mistakes, no inaccuracies, and 2 brilliant moves. And as I stated before, I have never had multiple brilliant moves in any game I have ever played. So a special shout out to you, my friend. I will not name drop you on the channel, but I do appreciate the game. It's one of my favorites that I played this year. If you enjoyed this video, I greatly appreciate you watching. If you don't mind, however, if you think I am deserving of such, a subscription to the channel would be most appreciated. I hope you learned a thing or two from this video. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much again for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Take care, everybody.